Thanks, Holly. Kia ora, everybody. My name is Veronica Desane, and I'm the registrar here at Engineering New Zealand. And we've also got Chris Shaw assisting us with the session today, and I'll just quickly hand over to Chris so he can introduce himself.
Oina kia koutou katoa, ko Chris toku ingoa. I've been a knowledge assessor and lead assessor for the last 18 years. I'm also quite actively involved in mentoring engineers. About the last 10 years, I've been working with quite a few companies, mainly in the civil area, mentoring them. And so hopefully we can share some of the thoughts of both assessors and mentors as we go through the session today. Back to you, Veronica.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. I will take you through our assessment process. Chris will then talk about how to prepare for your knowledge assessment, and we'll go through some application requirements. And then we'll also talk about applying for CPEng after your knowledge assessment. And then we'll open up to questions. But as Holly said, we do have some assessment advisors in the session who will be answering your questions as much as they can in the Q&A function. So you can pop your questions in there while we're talking. Cool, so I'll just go through the assessment process. So as of today, we've got 2 knowledge assessment pathways that are available. We've got our standard knowledge assessment, which is available to all applicants and takes approximately 50 working days. We then also have a fast track knowledge assessment pathway option. This is for applicants who are needing a knowledge assessment for immigration and need their application to be prioritized urgently due to that visa application. We aim to complete those within 25 working days. Looking at our process, so all knowledge assessments, regardless of which of those 2 pathways you've chosen, will go through the same 6 stages. So stage 1 is a credential check. So you always need to start your journey with us with a credential check. You need to create a profile on our Engineering New Zealand website, and you need to upload your credentials, and we need to verify them, and we then check whether they meet the global standards defined through the Washington Accord. If they don't, and you don't meet the Washington Accord standard, you'll then get some information on your next steps, which is a knowledge assessment. To prepare for the knowledge assessment, we really encourage you to read our new guidance documents. That's just been published on our website yesterday. It's got a whole lot more detail than the previous one had. So please do go and check it out. It's on our Get Chartered page. How to apply. It's there on with all the rest of our application guidance documents. We also encourage you to use our summary statement form throughout your preparation to kind of track the evidence that you would be able to use for your knowledge assessment. We also encourage you to prepare your CV in line with the guidance that's in our documentation. Stage 3 is the actual online application. So then you'd need to go back and just update your details. You might have some extra credentials you might have done, or some of your personal details might have changed. So please go and update your details there, request a knowledge assessment, and then fill in the online application form. Once you submit it to us, we will then validate the application. And what that means is we're just checking your application for completeness before we invite an assessor to evaluate your application. So one of our assessment advisors will have a look through what you've provided, and they may ask you to provide some additional information if there's something you've missed in your application. Stage 5 is evaluation. So this is where we invite an assessor to evaluate your application, and they then receive all your information and they go through the evaluation process with you. This may include an interactive interview as well as part of this process. Your assessor will then write up their report and provide the outcome as to whether or not you've met the Washington Accord equivalence. This is then submitted through to Engineering New Zealand, and then we email you with the outcome that you've got from there. As part of that report, they may give you some suggestions as to what you might be able to do to bridge any outstanding gaps. And if you do disagree or you would like the decision to be reviewed, we do have a process for that now. So that comes at a cost of $600, which is refundable if we find that there was a mistake made or the decision is changed. So that's a new process that we're going to be starting going forward. Right, the next section is all about how to prepare for your knowledge assessment. So I'll just take you through just defining the standard and what we actually use. So you'll need to demonstrate your equivalent knowledge in 8 areas, which we call elements. And they are determined by the knowledge profile expected of a graduate of a Washington Accord accredited qualification, and there's 8 of them. So you'll see everything that we do in the process and the application form, the summary statement form that you can use is all centered around these 8 elements. And I will now hand over to Chris, who is going to go into more detail as to how you could be prepared for your knowledge assessment. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Veronica. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see that we're talking about being prepared. One of the key things there is to try and understand what the gaps are in your study, and we'll look at some of the places to try in a second. But one of the things that people get quite upset is they think they're really proud of their qualification, and they suddenly get worried by the fact they think there might be a gap. So it's quite important to recognise that the 3 qualifications in New Zealand are quite different. There are different processes, and we'll look at this in some detail in a second. So planning then, if you understand there are some gaps, trying to work out how do I fill the gaps, or planning further study, we'll look at that. Part of the whole process here is about generating complex engineering experience, particularly with modelling, design and management. And certainly as an assessor, I've seen examples of actually analysing problems within modelling, within design and within management. And we recommend that you talk to people about how you do that. But the other thing is it takes time. There's a real pressure on people at the moment in terms of psyche, in terms of trying to get through the CPEng process as fast as possible. So typically people would say for a BE graduate, the minimum would be 4 years, but that could be 6 to 10 in many cases. And that traditionally has been the case, it would be 6 to 10. So if you've got an NZDE or a BEng Tech, perhaps thinking about possibly adding 2 to 3 years to both those figures, depending on how we go. Let's move across to the next one. Thank you. So let's have a look at these different engineering qualifications. First thing I'd say is this is me thinking out loud. I'm sure that there are some programs that could come under any of these 3 categories where you would find an exception to what's on the slide. I would be the first to admit that's probably true, but in general, they follow this pattern. So if we look at the diploma, it's the Dublin Accord qualification. It's meant for engineering technicians. Typical study period is 2 years. On what's called the New Zealand Qualification Framework or the National Qualification Framework, it's at levels 5 and 6. The problem types that people are exposed to are classed as being well defined, and I'll talk about what that actually means. The engineering mathematics is covered up to level 5, and it's as a qualification designed to be good for a sub-discipline or sub-branch within engineering. So it's quite a tight, narrow qualification. The BEng Tech builds on the diploma. That's the BEng Tech is the Sydney qual. It's designed for engineering technologists. It takes 3 years full-time typically. Study levels 5, 6 and 7. And it's designed for people who will be exposed to broadly defined engineering problems. And again, we'll talk about what that means later. In terms of engineering maths, there is level 5, often is the compulsory proposal, and level 6 will be optional. So there is a higher level maths paper that is optional for BEng Tech candidates. And that's designed often for sub-discipline or discipline. So it can be broader, it can be narrower, and it depends often on the interests of the staff that are teaching the program. And certainly looking at some of the examples we've seen in civil and mechanical, CPEng tech, there are differences sometimes, and it depends, I think, on the institution and the staff as to whether they're broader or narrower. And that's really tricky for people who've got the qualification to work out what that means in terms of their study gaps. Then let's move to the BE. That's the Washington Accord qualification for professional engineers. Typical study periods 4 years, taught at levels 5, 6, 7, and 8, but being universities, they don't call them levels 5, 6, 7, and 8, and we have to translate what that actually means for everybody when they study. The problem types that people are exposed to are complex engineering problems, and the maths would be taught typically at levels 5 and level 6, with an option to study maths at level 7. And that would be good for a much broader set of disciplines, possibly, than the other two qualifications, but it's not entirely cast in stone how that would work. Okay, so let's move across to the next one. So let's look at the identified gaps. So knowledge element 1 is about natural sciences. You need a broad understanding of physics and certainly chemistry and possibly biology. Looking at whether that's often a failure criterion, no, most people would come through this process because all the qualifications require some form of scientific background and they need exposure to complex problems, and that can be gained through work if it's not been gained through study. For the maths element, we require study at level 6. This is often a point of discussion during a knowledge assessment because people have not been aware that that's the requirement. And so there is a high risk if you've not got study at level 6 that this will be an area for further work after the assessment. In terms of engineering fundamentals or breadth of knowledge, this varies between programs. So some variants of the diploma and the CPEng tech are broader and some are narrower. So, but you can check, because the typical things we would find would be kinematics, dynamics, electrical topics, thermodynamics, and possibly coding or programming missing. This is another high risk area where people often will have some further work to do after the assessment. And so it needs to be very carefully checked when you're preparing. We do require experience of coding or programming, and we want a good range of the others, but we're not after perfection at this point. In terms of depth of knowledge, this needs to be at level 8, and it can come from a mix of further study or from the knowledge gained at work. And if you're younger and have just come out of your qualification, then I would suggest that you need some extra study and some additional knowledge gained at work. Again, this is one of those high risk areas if you're not prepared. Okay, let's move on to the next one, the second one for the gaps. So the design element, this is normally a low risk area. Most candidates, if they're working in an engineering company, have got lots of experience here. Sorts of things that could be missing though would be modeling experience or design experience, but this is actually quite rare. Element 6, the engineering technologies. Again, this is a very low risk area. Most people working in industry, the engineering industry, have this. And it's about lack of understanding about design as a process and the tools you use during it. Moving to engineering society, again, around ethical conduct, health and safety, social, cultural, environmental effects, and risk management. Most people sail through this one really easily, and most candidates bring really good evidence for that. Then finally, level 8, this can be tricky. I would say it was a medium risk of having additional work to do. We need engagement with work at level 8 and beyond, either in research institutions or in industry. And often that will come from further study and knowledge gained at work. Okay, let's move on again and let's look at putting this together for the options. How can we get around those gaps? How can we fill them for people? So let's have a look at how we might do that. There are 4 ways potentially you could do it. The first one would be online courses. These are easy to fit in with work because you do them when you want to. They're cheaper quite often, and they have fewer visa immigration issues than possibly a polytechnic or a university course. And generally people get through these really well. They quite enjoy them. And so I'd say the risk of failure without any intervention is quite low. Then moving to Polytechnic courses, these are really good because they have well-defined NZQA levels on the qualification framework. Some people find they can be hard work, but most people, it would be my experience, it actually works for them quite well. Then we move to university courses. These are ideal for study at level 8, although it won't be called level 8 in the university world, but that's okay. And I think the risk of failure is actually quite low. Most people do really well at them because their study experience from diploma, BEng Tech, moving on through their work experience provides really good background for these things. Self-study, this is a really interesting one. Relatively cheap because you just pay for the materials itself, say the textbook or whatever, it's self-paced. You possibly need some advice as to what topics to study, but my experience would be both as an assessor and a mentor, it's really difficult to see this through unless you're very motivated. I have seen people work really well, but for most, it's not a great option. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So this is about complex engineering problems. And if you come to apply for knowledge assessment, you really need to understand Engineering New Zealand's definition of complex engineering activities and complex engineering problems. And that's listed in the documentation that's on the Get Chartered page with guidance. You should discuss your work experience with your engineering mentor and manager. Get them to give you whether it's well. Be aware, particularly if you're working in a consultancy, that valuable engineering work may not be complex. You know, the role of companies is to do engineering work. Some engineering work is not that complicated or complex. And so it's really good if you can get some guidance as to which bits of the work you're doing are actually in that complex category. Possibly you might need to talk to your manager about a placement or job rotation to make sure you can get that experience by going to work in another part of the organization for a period, and possibly at the bottom, say 6 months appropriate time. Okay, Veronica, we'll move on. So getting things together. First thing we need are certificates for school study and tertiary. And a lot of people say, why do you want school study? Basically, it's to make sure we don't miss anything. We are trying positively to record all the positive interactions you've had with study, and we can make sure we've got everything as assessors. So please include all the relevant qualifications. We often learn of a full year of study during the video meeting, when something that for some reason people aren't too comfortable about will suddenly come to light, and it can be that full year of study that can change the whole assessment from being possibly marginal to being very positive. So please include everything you've got, particularly if it's engineering related. Your transcripts for those tertiary quals are really important to us. A hint as to what your key CPD activities, you'll see the note saying that the CPD listing is not required. That's true. But if you could just tell us about some of those key major pieces about CPD you've done, that would be great. Some notes on the content of each paper, and I'll show an example in a second, a brief CV, and the study episodes or work samples that show particularly the modeling work and your interaction with design. So if we move on, Veronica, please. So on the content, here's a couple of examples. It's just the name of the paper, say year 1 thermodynamics, whatever it was. And there you've got concepts and definitions. First law, steady state energy equation. Second law, cyclic heat power, pure substances and entropy. That's actually my first year thermo course. These are both my examples of what we did in first year. I've still got my notes behind me, even though it is 40 odd years ago since I did it. Second exam, year 1 structures, equilibrium, pin-jointed frameworks, displacement diagrams, virtual work, beams and bending, plastic theory, buckling, 2D stress, Moore circle and failure. Really simple. That gives us a really good indication of what you've been exposed to, and that's what we're trying to measure. Okay, Veronica, back to you.
Awesome, thank you, Chris. You may want to have a look through the Q&A area. There's quite a few questions that came up as you were talking.
Okay.
Right, I will just take everyone through the application requirements and what you can expect on your online form. So there's 4 main areas in the application. So the first being your profile. So you need to update your personal details and your contact information. Then we've got the CV and summary statement form. We've got the self-assessment, and then we've got the evidence. So those are the 4 areas in your application. Looking at the self-assessment, so what we're looking for here is statements of self-review explaining how you've met the standard for Washington Accord equivalence. And it's really helpful to our assessors here where if you could just reference your evidence as you're writing it up. So try to directly link each piece of evidence to specific performance indicators. So we've got an example that one of our assessors provided here, like in work sample 1, file number 3, I calculated whatever, indicating my use of knowledge of trigonometry, etc. So try to be really specific and reference your evidence to make it easier for your assessors to navigate through your application and be able to see that you've met the standard. And we generally suggest that you aim for around 500 words per element. The next section is your CV and summary statement form. So we've got some guidance for your CV. So we do advise that you keep it to 3 pages or less. And then you include the name, location, and contact details of your employment organizations, dates and duration, the title of your position, and how your work demonstrates Washington Accord equivalent knowledge. So if you think about your CV, you could potentially have your employer, your role, what you did, and then a second paragraph underneath that where you describe how the work you did meets that Washington Accord equivalent. That would really help our assessors to just understand each of the roles that you've worked in and how they contributed to your knowledge and got you to that Washington Accord equivalent level. Then clearly list your qualifications, the year the qualification was obtained, and the awarding education institutions. One thing here that we haven't mentioned yet is if your qualifications or your transcripts are not in English, we do need these to be translated by a certified translator so that we can, so that it makes sense to us. Otherwise, it's pretty meaningless. So please ensure that any evidence you provide is in English. The summary statement form. So this, I've been referring to this previously as well. So this is a form that you can use to track your progress against the elements and think about the evidence that you could use to demonstrate you meet the standard. So you can use this together with your mentor or your employer and kind of use it as a tool to, get involved in different projects that could help you on specific elements where you need to bridge some knowledge gaps. We really encourage you to check your once you think you're done, please check this with your manager and mentor and, discuss potential development areas. We do ask that you submit your completed form together with your CV in the application portal, just so that it just helps our assessors. It gives them a summary of your application and helps to speed up the process. In terms of the evidence, so we ask that you include a single PDF file for each of your qualifications, just to give a brief description of the qualification. Remember that our assessors don't know every single qualification that exists out there. So it really helps if you could just describe what the qualification entailed. And if you're going to be using on-the-job training as evidence, we encourage you to submit up to 4 work samples, and then within each work sample, I think we said about 3 files within that. So we don't want you to drown us in every single project that you've ever worked on. Try to keep it very specific to the elements, and Chris has suggested to keep the commentary simple. The work samples that you do provide should be clear, professionally presented, so that an assessor can easily confirm your knowledge. We don't want our assessors having to go and find or draw it out of you. We really need you to demonstrate that you've met the standard through your application. All right, back to you, Chris, for the study episodes or work samples tips.
Thank you, Veronica. So let's just look at what we need to put together here. So really, we're talking about people describing their work in complex modeling and design. So let's talk about what complex modeling actually is. So some examples might be that it's complex if there are many entities, or it's non-linear or time dependent. So for example, if you're a civil person and you're doing an overland flow path, the single overland flow path itself might be described as well-defined, or it could be broadly defined if there were some more complexity factors. But if you then were doing that just for steady flow, it certainly would be well-defined. If it was a flooding example, that might be an overland flow path that actually you watch it rise in time, the level of water, and then come down again over time, that would be complex. So these things are quite tricky to determine. So for example, if you've got A follows to B follows to C, that's quite linear. But if A and B and C are so intimately related that if I change A, B changes and C changes, then they're all interdependent, and that would be complex. So examples of complex would be water flow in a reasonably large pipe network, or a stress displacement analysis for a portal frame, or possibly a finite element analysis of a component, be it in 2D or 3D. It could be a geotech analysis of water flow or of slope stability or something like that too. Please, for each work sample, only use up to 4 files, because that keeps it simpler for us to actually see the evidence and to get to it. Okay, Veronica, we'll move on. So let's look at the 8 elements and where we would be taking evidence from. So the first element, natural sciences, we'd be looking at school study, tertiary study, the knowledge you've gained from work, and also your work samples and the episodes. But we use the video meeting to try and understand as much as we can about that knowledge from work and the bits we can't see on paper. And so it's really important in the video meeting not to be worried about it. It's not a test, but it's just a discussion of the sorts of things you've been involved in and been exposed to in terms of knowledge. In terms of mathematics, we look at school study, tertiary study, and knowledge from work, though often it's the school and tertiary study we would be most interested in, and it needs to be at level 6. Breadth of knowledge, school study, tertiary study, knowledge from work. We're looking at this, how broad a set of engineering knowledge have you got? There is some flexibility about what that breadth is, and perfection is certainly not required, but we do need a reasonably broad profile. And depth of knowledge, again, looking at tertiary study or knowledge from work, and that needs to be at level 8. Let's move on. Thanks, Veronica. So element 5, engineering design, mainly comes from the commentary you write and from the work samples. And we use the video meeting to explore that in detail. And same for engineering technologies. Engineering society, we don't need lots of evidence, and we don't particularly want very sensitive evidence as to how you've dealt with certain things, but we can just discuss it in broad terms during the video meeting. And finally, the engagement with research, a lot of that will come from commentary that you've written yourself, and from the CPD records, and from the way you've structured those work samples. Let's move on again. Interactive assessment. So, is it a test? No. Is it an examination? No. We'll just discuss what sorts of things you've been involved in, what sort of things you've studied, and how you use all that stuff at work. We're trying to explore exposure to knowledge. We don't want to look at retention of detail. Okay, thanks, Veronica. We'll move on. So the good thing about doing the knowledge assessment is a lot of the evidence you can use can be used again, and also it gives you confidence. So here we are on this, what's more or less the final slide, actually. So after the knowledge assessment, the team at Engineering New Zealand will tell you the outcome. Hopefully, if you've been successful, you can then go on and CPEng application online through the portal, build that up there. And look, you can actually use quite a lot of it. So quite a lot of the evidence for the knowledge assessment can be useful for group 1, the engineering knowledge you've got. That's not that surprising. there's quite a lot of evidence around professional acumen and the soft skills, and there's a lot of evidence around developing technical solutions. And all that stuff can more or less be transferred straight across, reworded in the context of the groups of information we need. But it makes it a really positive experience. And my understanding for most people I've mentored and assessed is that once they've got through the knowledge assessment, they fly through the panel interview for CPEng really easily. And then I think we come to questions, of which there are quite a few.
That's right. So I think
I'm
we've
quite
got,
happy to answer some of these online, if that's okay, Veronica.
yes, perfect. Go for it.
So let me go through them. We've got 14 at the moment that are open. The first one, is there a big gap between NZDE and BEng Tech? It's just a study process, and we can look at that in terms of you just follow the process and you're going to go from level 6 in knowledge to level 7. There's going to be quite a lot of exposure to industrial stuff depending on the program you do. And, you know, there are some BEng Tech project work at level 7 that in reality you might say was at level 8. So is there a gap? There's a little gap, but it all follows through quite neatly, I think, is the answer to that question. Next one, what are the additional qualifications, assessments needed for those engineers graduated overseas and not from a Washington Accord university? So really, it's just following the process we've outlined. There is some discussion going on between one tertiary provider and Engineering New Zealand at the moment about a sort of matching course that could be provided that would take particularly BEng Tech people through to Washington Accord status. There is a similar program currently in Australia that does do that, but equally it can be done by the techniques we've outlined in the seminar. The next one is, what qualification is required to upgrade to BEng Tech or BEng Tech to BE? I think that's the same question. There is possibly going to be a qualification available in New Zealand within the next few years. There is currently one available in Australia. But really, if you follow the process, you can do that based with your team at work as well. If study at level 6 maths was done part of BEng Tech, are further study papers required in mathematics? The answer is no. That's all good. We've got that sorted. And the next one is the assessment discipline specific? So if your work history is geometric design and road safety and not structures, will I be expected, where have I gone? It's gone up, somebody's come up. Will I be expected to answer structural questions? For all engineers, it's interesting to know how much structural knowledge people have got in the sense of, have you been exposed to it? And we would discuss that. We wouldn't probably say to you, go and stress this next. Can one work towards a CPEng qualification without having done undergraduate study? If by that you mean at a BE level, it's perfectly possible to have a diploma alone and work experience and prepare yourself in the way we've described to go through to CPEng. It's the same for BEng Tech. And over the last 10 years, lots of engineers have been very successful doing that. The next one is, can somebody working in a local central government sector apply for CPEng, even though the design problem solutions are done by externals or consultings? What evidence is required for someone working in that sector? Okay, for the knowledge assessment, that shouldn't make any difference at all. But you would still need to gather that modeling experience, and you would need to gather that understanding of design as a process, because that's what would be expected of a Washington Accord graduate. On to the next one. I'm a graduate in civil from the Philippines, currently work here in Singapore as a CAD Revit modeler for a construction company last 5 years. I've got my NZQA result equivalent to level 7. Do I need to have a work experience in New Zealand to register? That's an interesting question. To actually to join Engineering New Zealand, the answer is no, you can join from overseas, that's perfectly fine. The BSc in Civil would equate to an engineering qualification, so you could join on the Emerging Professional Member pathway. In terms of, do you need work experience in New Zealand for CPEng? The answer to that is at this moment, yes, because CPEng is specific to the New Zealand jurisdiction. So joining Engineering New Zealand, you would not need to work here to go through CPEng. You would need experience of working in New Zealand or understanding how the New Zealand engineering system works. Down to, are there some recommended online or other maths courses that meet the requirements if you haven't got the right level of maths? Okay, so online mathematics courses. Colleagues at the Open Polytechnic used to offer papers out in Australia, currently changing over. So the BEng Check at Open Polytechnic is becoming fully online, but based on the same papers that would be here in New Zealand for the other providers. The level 6 maths paper is on their list. I don't yet think it is available. So other people are looking at other ways and going elsewhere, but there are online options certainly coming for that level 6 maths paper. Then we've got someone with an NZDE and NZDEP. I was under the impression that my pathway would not need extra study to be able to apply for CPEng. Yes. I'm sorry that you're under that impression. There are pathways that could come from work experience only with those qualifications, but you would need a lot of work experience and gain the extra knowledge that way. It says, I'll never need to know about thermodynamics or UDES coding. Why am I being asked to do this to become civil? At this stage, the coding we would like to see some examples of, because it shows the sorts of thought processes that a Washington Accord graduate would have. And in terms of thermodynamics, that isn't compulsory. On to the next one. Can experience be gained pre-diploma used in the minimum of 4 years experience? This is a very interesting question. Is what does graduation mean in a sense? So does graduation 4 years mean when you finish the diploma or BEng Check or some other qualification, or does it mean when you do the knowledge assessment? At the moment, we are flexible in how we treat that. So there are no hard requirements as to when the 4 years would take us. On the next one, I've got chartered member technologist and discussing the process with people in the office. I realized the process in terms of work experience is the same. Is the entire process necessary, or will simply a knowledge assessment be sufficient? So for that question about going from a chartered member as a technologist to chartered member CPEng professional engineer, the process is the same, but the problems that are assessed essentially are at broadly defined for technologist level. They are at complex level for professional CPEng, and so the knowledge assessment and a further panel interview would be required. Somebody says, I studied 30 years ago and study examples are not available or really applicable. How can I deal with that step? Yeah, we've got that where the work, we've actually used professional work samples from people. I've just recently mentored somebody who got through knowledge assessment 2 or 3 weeks ago, who's actually older than I am and studied before I did. And we used professional work samples to get through that, not study examples from study or work experience. I've just used the work experience one. Where are we now? Top one again, come back up. Study, I've done that. So study completed 30 years ago. I think we've done that one. Where to find a mentor? Veronica, do you want to answer that in terms of the new system that's coming online?
Well, currently we do have, Engineering New Zealand does have a Mentor Me program. it's not specific to knowledge assessments in particular, but it is something that we're looking to potentially work with our professional development partners with in the coming months. Currently, we don't have a very strong knowledge assessment specific mentor program. So that's kind of, we leave it to the applicants at the present moment. But yeah, watch this space. It is something that we are working on, hopefully giving some support with in the future.
Okay, next one's, what if my discipline is niche, such as facade or fire engineering? The knowledge assessment seems focusing on mathematics. No, the mathematics is 1/8 of the component. The other 7 are not necessarily mathematical related. So no, it's not focused on mathematics. It's just one component. How about an overseas qualification with Washington Accord Tier 2? I'm not sure that I understand the Tier 2 part, unless you mean use of further study for a qualification that requires further study to go from being Sydney to Washington, which there are some, particularly from the UK. So I'm confused by that question. If that person wants to email in, we can fix that one. Where can I find definitions of level of achievement? The levels on the qualification framework are listed on the New Zealand NZQA website. That would be the best source to look at the levels we use and what they mean. Essentially 1, 2, and 3 are at high school. 4 is between school and tertiary. 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the 4 years of a tertiary qualification. So diploma 5, 6, BEng Tech 5, 6, 7, Washington Accord Qual 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9 is a master's and 10 is a PhD. What about diploma level 6, BEng Tech, and MEng level 9, all gained in New Zealand? Has still to go through the full KA process. At this point, the answer to that is yes, because we can't determine from the qualification if the MEng covered the appropriate mathematics. We can't determine the breadth of knowledge necessarily either, unless we go through the full process. So that's what we would be doing. Land development engineer, no specific quals. Most local authorities have a job role created in this. Is there a specific course Engineering New Zealand recommends for land development engineers? No. Tier 1 local authority, will there be a process to become CPEng with a diploma in civil, and how much does it require? So that's really the process we've outlined today, would be exactly the process for people working in those scenarios, I think is the best answer to that question. Let's go on to the next one. Tertiary institution, BSc Applied Science, seems to have lost its Sydney Accord accreditation. Okay, if it's Sydney Accord, you would need to follow the knowledge assessment process anyway. So that's fine. Can you provide an example of a complex engineering problem in terms of construction engineering? Yes, I did, as a lead assessor, I did a couple of construction engineers last year. They have very complex management problems to deal with. Taking materials, people across multiple sites from multiple locations, getting them there, doing the work and getting them out again can be an extremely complex problem itself. So that would be an example of a construction engineering problem that's complex. Somebody said thank you. Somebody's got CM Technologist. Would the knowledge assessment allow me to transfer directly to CPEng Gen Z, or would I need another competence assessment? I think sadly in that case, yes, you need the knowledge assessment and the further competence assessment because of the change in the type of problems you have to deal with for CPEng. Let's go on to the next one. Completed my BEng Tech from India, having 14 years experience. Engineering, currently doing a master's from New Zealand University. Do I have to attach work samples or rewrite my own words covering the 8 elements. You need to write something in your own words to cover the 8 elements. You do need 4 work samples. That's really simple. Good news, people from BTech from India, normally they're successful. Recommend attached study examples from the masters. Yeah, they can be fine, or from BTech, whichever you wish. I've got transcripts from the BTech. Yep, no, that's fine. It says, should I wait until I complete my masters in New Zealand? Yeah, you could do. You may not need to, though. That would be fine. Going on to the next one. Oh, I've got a BEng Tech at level 7. Would this qualify my maths at the required level 6? If you have the pass in the particular paper, yes. If not, no. Let's move on to the next one. If you're familiar with how the University of Auckland operates, is there a direct relationship between level 6, 7, 8, etc. and 200, 300, 400 papers? Yes, that's exactly the equivalence we would look at. 6 is 200, 7 is 300, 8 is 400. You mentioned exposure to knowledge rather than retention of detail. For those who studied 15 years ago, I haven't done level 6 maths, would they be expected to attend a course just to gain the exposure? Yes. So we are trying to make sure when we do all these assessments that we can show there is a rational reason for giving equivalence to Washington Accord. We need to do that to maintain the status of engineering in New Zealand worldwide. And so, yes, we do need people to show they've had exposure to level 6 mathematics. Do I need to just do have an engineering degree that's not Washington Accord? The answer to that probably is you still do need to do the knowledge assessment. But based on that experience, we would be checking the things we've talked about today. Mathematics, breadth of knowledge, depth of knowledge. I think that there's a level 6 paper through the online Polytechnic. Yes, that's correct, there is, but whether it's available at this time is something that we're waiting for an answer from Open Polytech. If you've cleared KA and achieved CPEng, would there still be a difference between an individual who's degree qualified as opposed to someone who is diploma qualified? In terms of working practically on the ground in a company, no. That's really straightforward. 25 years of experience, 6 months in New Zealand since coming over. BN or BTech qualification plus further studies. Further study required for CPEng, or will the experience suffice? Until we ran the knowledge assessment process, we won't know. But that's fine. For the coding and programming element, is the use of design packages such as Civil 3D or OpenRoad sufficient? It would depend if you've used the tools of coding to drive those programs, and it is possible to do that. But we would expect some understanding of algorithm and how to direct software using algorithm. Often people use Visual Basic because if you open Excel and you switch on developer mode, you have access to all the Visual Basic programming tools there. On to the next one. Would you recommend people waiting until they're wanting to submit for CPEng before starting the knowledge assessment, or do you suggest starting knowledge assessment sooner to identify the gaps? That's a really good question. Personally, I think that the knowledge assessment, a lot of people get worried by the fact the word assessment is in the title. We much rather would use this as a mentoring process so that people who come forward, we will work with you in a way to get through the knowledge assessment. If we identify some gaps then and there's some further work to do, then that's fine. And we can just get that tidied off over 6 months, 12 months, and it's all good. So if you want to start early and we help use the knowledge assessment to identify the gaps, that's perfectly acceptable. And membership before going for CPEng in terms of submission. The process is the same chartered membership as CPEng. If it was a chartered membership technologist, the problems would be broadly defined, for example, or for technician, chartered member, they would be well defined. For chartered membership professional engineer, it's complex. CPEng, it's complex. So the good thing about having chartered membership at any level is it gives you a really good experience of going through the whole process. And so some people choose to and get a lot out of it, and some people don't. The choice is entirely up to the applicant.
If I could just add there, Chris,
Yes,
a
go.
lot of international applicants choose to go through a chartered membership because they don't have the New Zealand specific knowledge and
Yeah.
experience that CPEng requires. So our chartered membership option does not require that New Zealand specific knowledge and experience, whereas CPEng does. If you become a chartered member and then you move to New Zealand and you've worked in New Zealand, now you've got some work samples, you can then apply for a short form. It's called a mutual recognition assessment, where you just providing information on your New Zealand specific knowledge, and then you'll be able to get CPEng that way. So it's up to you if you want to or you need to get a chartered status overseas. You can do so, and then you can do that mutual recognition short form assessment when you're in New Zealand and have your New Zealand specific knowledge and experience. That's how you can kind of bridge over to CPEng from CMEng.
No, that's good. So we've got one here. Does chartered member technician technologist and NDT provide level 6 equivalent maths? The answer is chartered member technician technologist would require level 5 mathematics. So no, the answer is no. When compiling the evidence under each element, is it best to just reference your work records and the relevant work, and then within each work record, I noted you can add a comment to it when uploading. Should I detail specifics here in the comment section? I would try and keep the evidence very self-contained within the commentary box. So the 8 boxes available for the knowledge assessment and the 4 for the CPEng assessment. That way, you're sure that the assessor will see it. We'll move to the next one. Can you provide an example of complex engineering in terms of pavement engineering? Yep, that's fairly straightforward. So the sort of complexity in pavement engineering would be using Circly to look at the structure of a pavement through the depth of the pavement, and they'll be looking at multiple layers, multiple material types, and that analysis I would think is complex. I've got an NZQA assessment at level 6. Can I straight away get registered as an engineering technologist? My answer to that would be, and I'll let Veronica comment as well, if it's an NZQA qualification in engineering at level 6, the answer is probably you'd need to go through the, at level 6, no, for technology you need level 7. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. I apologize. Can complex problems be low cost? Say engineering required for housing or a block of residential units. That depends. Say it was a building structure that was low cost. If it was the analysis of a beam, I would say that was well defined or broadly defined. If there was an analysis of portal frames or the 3D structure itself, that could well be complex. Okay. Do you know if CPEng follows the same process? Okay, so CPEng is the UK Chartered Institute for Building Services Engineers. CPEng is a member of the Engineering Council in the UK, I believe. So they would follow essentially the same process as we do here in New Zealand. Let's move to the next one. Oh, yeah, I would also want to know if it will work the other way around. If we have CPEng, can it be converted to similar accreditation with Engineers Australia, or we need another assessment? Veronica, do you want to answer the ones on mutual recognition?
Yep, so Engineers Australia do recognise our CPEng registration, and we are going to be putting up some information on the Australia process in the coming weeks. But it's better to check directly with them and go onto their website to check their requirements.
Yeah. Okay. Can you provide a complex structural engineering problem that would be used in a case study? Yep. So in structural engineering, if we are talking about structural engineering applied to buildings, for example, if you were doing a 2D portal frame with sufficient elements in it, that would be complex. A single beam wouldn't. A complex 3D analysis using a pushover analysis for earthquake analysis or a full nonlinear earthquake analysis would definitely be complex. Move on to the next one. Yeah, okay, I've just gone, my screen keeps changing. I completed the NZD 15 years. Just a second while I get back to the top of the screen. Did a diploma 15 years ago. At the time, I completed the highest available mathematical methods 5, understood to be from first professional year. From what I understand now, I need level 6. Is levels 5 15 years ago still equivalent to level 5 now? That would take some effort to determine, I'm afraid. We'd have to look at what was taught to work that out. The next one is industrial plant design setup, P&ID, power layout, mass energy balance, mechanical design of conveyors, pipes considered as a complex problem. It could well be, if there are, yep, there is nothing in that area that would preclude it at all. Will the NZQA assessment be sufficient evidence of a degree, or do you need transcripts? No. So if you have an NZQA assessment of your qualification, that tells us that it is at a certain level determined by NZQA at its endpoint. It tells us nothing about the content. So we would need the transcripts in that case. Next question, if the knowledge assessment is a mentoring process, is the one application continued has been successful within reason, or do you want to reapply if gaps are identified, or do you have to reapply? Do you want to answer that? I will keep quiet.
So this, yes. So if your assessor identifies that you've got just 1 or 2 areas that you've got to bridge knowledge gaps on, and you can do so within the next 12 months, then your subsequent application, is not going to be charged. So what we'll then do is leave your application open in editing. You can then go and do the courses or whatever your assessor has recommended. You can upload that evidence and then you can resubmit it to us, and you will not be charged for that. If it's more than 2 areas and it's going to take you longer than 12 months to bridge those knowledge gaps, then unfortunately you will need to resubmit a brand new knowledge assessment at that time.
Okay, next one. Is the proposed practice area taken into account for a knowledge assessment, e.g. low hazard areas, residential geotech engineering compared to high hazard? We take it into account. I'm not sure it's awfully relevant though, because we're just looking at exposure to knowledge and what knowledge you've gained. So we do take it into account though, so we have a good idea which areas you're working in. Can you provide an example of a complex engineering problem in mechanical engineering? A live knowledge assessment from about 3 years ago had an awesome finite element analysis of the bogey of a set of trains. Within the New Zealand context would be one example. It could be a complex system design with control engineering. Lots of examples from mechanical engineering. Where are we? How crucial are the course bio descriptions of what I've studied? Some NZCE courses I did many years ago are shown in my transcript. We're not site so descriptive. I would say if you have an NZCE, we have quite a lot of experience of what civil A means. And we could very quickly decode that and work with the candidate to work that out. That's no issue at all. We're seeing less NZCE people now. When I first started in 2005, they were still quite common. Most New Zealand applicants had NZCE. And then from probably 2010 onwards, there were a mix of diploma and BEng Tech. So organisations offering a standalone level 6 maths paper, most polytechnics offer a paper known as MG 6190, which is Mathematics 2, and that is a standalone level 6 maths paper. This is a question. CPEng from Aussie or the UK are directly converted to CPEng in New Zealand, or I have to be in New Zealand to get the references to sign my application a year of experience first. Slightly more complicated than that. Veronica, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so that is a mutual recognition assessment that you'd need to request. So we do recognise CPEng in Australia and the UK. So you would go through a shorter CPEng assessment with us, which will only ask you about your engineering knowledge, and that's where you'll need to provide some information on your New Zealand specific knowledge and experience. You won't need to go through the full CPEng assessment on all the 12 elements. It will only be focused on your engineering knowledge that is relevant to New Zealand. Yeah.
So we've got a question here. Sorry, says stormwater and wastewater, can they be complex? Yes, they can. The last 10 years I've worked for a land development company providing mentoring for their engineers to come through. We have a lot of complex stormwater and wastewater examples. Potable water, flooding, detention ponds in time where the multiple entries come in, the pond rises over time and then it falls. That's all extraordinarily complicated and complex. Coding requirements, Excel, Python or BASIC. Will PLC programming or programming of complex control suffice? No, that's all fine. We will take any evidence, providing it involves algorithmic development and all those things do, it's fine. What if you're going to be assessed for chartered member technologists soon, but the work samples provided are complex and meet the requirements? Would one be awarded chartered member in full or as a technologist if the assessors are convinced during the interactive session? I've got a view on that, but I'll let you answer that, Veronica.
So we use the same assessors for all of our chartership applications. And we have had instances where people have applied for CPEng or CMEng, and they've only been awarded CMEng technologist or technician. But I guess it's kind of up to you if you're able to demonstrate the level of complexity that's required. I guess it's a discussion with your assessors on that. But if you think you've got the complexity meeting the requirements of CMEng, then I'd recommend you apply for that, so that it's your assessors know what they're assessing.
The only thing I would caution there is I agree with that. I think that the flexibility is really good. Is if you're applying for a technologist and you haven't had a knowledge assessment, you would need the knowledge assessment first to meet the first block.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. On to the next one. I'm a BEng Tech at level 7, which is not a taught qualification, but a knowledge assessment completed through Capable NZ. Is this sufficient to demonstrate competency in mathematics? As with all BEng Tech qualifications, unfortunately, in that case is, unless it specifically says you have mathematics at level 6, we'd need to have a look at it. What equivalent NZQA level would NZCE stage 3 be? It was a year full time. NZDE is only 1 semester. Yep, really good question. What is NZCE? So it's 3130 or something? It was the NZCE paper at stage 3. It's probably going to be somewhere 4-5 would be my guess. I think stage 4 is heading the old stage 4 paper. And there is actually a stage 5 and 6 paper that are, stage 3 would be at 4 or 5, I think, probably 5. As a structural BIM technician manager with an NZDE civil, I do not do calcs or ETABS type modeling. Are there complex examples from my line of work? It could well be in that case that the complexity comes from the management analysis. If you're doing distribution of goods, people, places, arranging people working around, there are complex examples certainly there. And live assessment I'm thinking of did somebody who was an aircraft engineer who'd done, in fact, a master's at Canterbury in management, and the examples he used, he came from a very much technician or trade background. And the examples that he showed me in the end were all management complex examples and came out of the master's study. But that's, yep, next one. For industrial operations in a quarry, are there examples of complex problems? Well, there could be geotech type issues. Some planning could be for traffic management, would look possibly sediment control plans. Difficult without looking as to whether they're broadly defined or complex. They could be either, but certainly in mining and quarrying, there are people who've qualified with all their evidence in that area at the complex level. Does project management of a food manufacturing factory be considered complex? In terms of the complexity definitions, there is a high chance that that would be complex because it would have lots of interaction. There would be lots of use of engineering knowledge in depth. The question is where the work was actually done and who'd done it, I suspect, but the project itself and the problem would be complex. On the next one, what split proportion of chartership numbers do you see more structural against roading applications? Does chartership add more value? Do you want to answer that one, Veronica?
Sorry, I was busy answering another one.
Not a problem. That's yeah.
What disciplines have a higher proportion of chartership numbers? So it's structural and civil are our biggest two. Yeah. Just on the CPEng referees. So on that question, I'll just answer live rather than just have
okay, no worries, that's fine.
So the CPEng referees, they need to be CPEng or equivalent, and we've got guidance in our documentation as to how we define CPEng equivalent. So please have a read of those documents and feel free to email us if you would like us to check this for you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Diploma qualified engineer, would NZ consider a full design of a brand new sliding canopy for an aircraft as a complex problem? Highly likely that we would. Would be the answer. If I complete a knowledge assessment applying for chartered member and my application and experience also meet the minimum requirements, we've already answered that question. I think that we would consider, we'd be flexible. Yeah. And go, yeah, that's fine. Somebody's got an engineering trade, an NZ background with an NZD mechanical. Can examples of management of projects from trade be used as examples if they're complex enough? In terms of analysis, yep, that's certainly true. Yep, that would be possible.
Wow, we made it to the end of the questions.
We've got to the end of the question. There's another one coming up, that's fine. Can you provide an example of a complex problem in road safety and transport? Okay, so transportation, often the modeling around junction design, roundabouts, use of SIDRA, use of the more complex modeling tools for a network model for a roading system. They're all complex problems that I can think of. Now we've got no more questions.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. And here is our email. If you would like to get in touch with further questions, you're welcome to get in touch with our assessment team and we will answer them for you.